Good evening. It is Wednesday, April 7th, 2021. It is 6:30 p.m. here in Palmyra, Indiana, and welcome to Bible Study PAL, the virtual midweek Bible study of the Palmyra Church of Christ as we still meet virtually here on YouTube on Wednesday evenings. I'm Greg Circle, the preacher for that congregation, and we're so thankful that you've joined us today, whether at 6:30 or as we go live or a little later, if you can catch this on the rerun, on the repeat. So we're certainly glad that you've joined us to continue and conclude our study of the Sermon on the Mount and go on into Matthew chapter 8. That's my plan. So let's get in on the study. Let's continue on and let's talk about the book of Matthew. Finishing up the Sermon on the Mount, we're still in part 2 of the book of Matthew, looking at the basics of the kingdom. And especially when we get into chapter 8, we're going to see more basics. Some really interesting points kind of jump out to me in chapter 8. But again, we're in the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to finish up with Matthew chapter 7 today, finish up the Sermon on the Mount. And, you know, we really want to include that in this idea of the basics of the kingdom, because this is what a lot of people call the constitution of the kingdom of God. So that's an interesting way of looking at it, and it is. These are very basic things for us as Christians, as disciples of Jesus, to live by in our lives. So we go back to what we've talked about so far, where we ended last week in Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus says, basically, don't be a hypocrite, because the hypocrites look to the earth, they look to the physical. That's where they treasure things. And if you store up for yourselves treasures on earth, those treasures fail. So keep your view clear. Look at God, serve God, because He'll never let you down. And so don't worry. Ask your Father. Then Jesus continues with everyone's favorite verse, Matthew chapter 7 and verse 1. So let's look at the whole paragraph where Jesus says, don't judge. He says, do not judge, so that you will not be judged. For the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So it's, like I said, this is everyone's favorite verse, Matthew 7, verse 1. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. And they kind of stop there. But they kind of miss the point of the rest of this paragraph. And I think it's summed up in a cartoon that I saw. And, I found it several years ago. I haven't really been able to find it since. But it's three guys standing standing in a line, and one guy has just a little speck in his eye, just a little splinter, and then another guy has like the trunk of a tree, one that is a stump of a tree in his eye, and he says to the guy with the speck, let me get that speck out of your eye. And then you go to the third guy who's got this great big tree coming out of his eye and says, judge not that you be not judged. And I just find that funny, because that's the way it ends up being. That's the way people who really push this do not judge idea, that's what they're being. That's what they're doing. They've got this great big tree coming out of their eyes. And I know people like to talk about how Jesus is using this hyperbole, really. It is a humorous little thing. You've got, your brother has this little speck in his eye that you can just pick out, but you've got this big 2x4 coming out of your eye. And it is pretty funny that you got this big 2x4 trying to get close enough to find this speck in your brother's eye. You're going to end up clocking him upside the head, aren't you? With your 2x4. You don't notice the log that's in your own eye. Well, how can you not notice it? You just don't. Um, First, take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. So don't judge. Don't judge initially. Remember, I think I should have put Galatians. What is it? Is it Galatians 6 in here? Um, you know, you who are righteous, restore the. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but you need to restore others. And here it is. Okay. Galatians chapter 6, starting in verse 1. Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. So, there is this idea that we have to help people, and we do have to. I don't know if I want to say judge. I don't know what the word would be though. But we do have to make a decision. We have to say this is right, this is wrong, and we have to then make sure that we're looking at ourselves, just like Paul says to the Galatian Christians, and that we are gentle in our correcting, if the correction is indeed deserved. But remember, don't judge. I mean, that is in there. That is the verse. And you've got to look at what Jesus says next. I'm just going to add verse 6 to here. And he says, do not give what is holy to the dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. So I wonder if Jesus is saying here, people are not dogs and swine. Don't judge them to be that. I think one of the things that we can look at here is, going back to what Jesus said about loving your enemy, and if your brother has something against you, go to him. Is right before that, isn't it? He says, if anyone who calls his brother a fool, anyone who says to his brother, you fool, shall be guilty of, be in danger of hellfire, of eternal punishment. So there is that idea. Don't be a judge in that way. And maybe that's what Jesus is getting at here. This is kind of the next step. This might be one of those you have heard it said statements. We just don't have that phrase at the beginning. There's another way to look at it too, and you have to look at it maybe with what comes next instead of what comes before. Don't judge. Do not give what is holy to dogs. Well, that sounds kind of like a judgment, doesn't it? You don't want to give what is holy to dogs. You don't want to throw your pearls before swine. Otherwise, you're going to get attacked. And that's kind of an interesting point too, especially with what Jesus says next in verses 7 through 12. In verses 7 through 12, Jesus says, of Matthew chapter 7, ask and it will be given to you. So he's just said, let me put 6 in here as well. Let me put 6 in here, where he says, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Don't give what is holy to dogs. Ask, and it will be given to you. I wonder if there's a connection there. So don't give what's holy to dogs, but ask, and it will be given to you. So I wonder if this is kind of the thing that Jesus is getting at here. Don't, in this case, be careful. Don't be the one who is giving, but the one who's asking, especially when you consider who you need to ask from. Because really, what can we give God? Instead, he's saying, ask. What's he saying? Let's go back. Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Or what man is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If you then, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to be treated to treat you. Well, let's go back for a second. It hit me. Something hit me there. He says, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? Do not give what is holy to dogs. What are you? What are you in God's eyes? And especially if you are outside of Christ, you're an enemy, maybe rebellious. Could you imagine if God had the attitude, do not cast your pearls before swine, do not give what is holy to dogs? He wouldn't have given us what we need. So what's the lesson? In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law, and this is the law and the prophets. So the lesson is treat them how you want to be treated. Don't judge. Don't judge someone to be unworthy of truth. Don't judge them to be a fool, but treat them the way you want to be treated. And maybe one of the things that we can learn from this is ask questions. Ask questions so that you can get to understand the position of those who would fight against you, those who would be against you. All right, so that's one of the basics of the kingdom. And then Jesus goes into the next sort of idea in chapter 7, verses 13 through 23. He says, enter through the narrow gate. And there's a couple of interesting points here, which I've pointed out several times, so I won't belabor them too much, but let's read the scriptures here. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few that find it. I want to pause there for just a moment and talk about what Jesus says there, that people enter the broad way. He says, broad is the way, wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. You know, that's almost, I mean, it is an active voice verb, but it's almost passive in how they do it. They enter. And as a matter of fact, I think, it might be a middle, probably a deponent verb. I mean, that's technical term. But it basically has an active meaning, but it's passive, or it's middle voice in its construction. And I've talked about middle voice verbs before. Anyway, idea is this, that there is kind of a passive idea, or, it's not just that you choose to, you just do it. I mean, it's a way that entrance, the way you enter something, it's almost a passive thing. But how does Jesus continue? People enter the broad way, but people find the narrow way. They find it. They find it. There's action there. You've got to be looking to find something. It's like something that's lost. Something that's not where you think it would be, not where you think it should be. I left my sunglasses at home this morning on my way out to go teach at school today, and they weren't in the car where I thought they were, where I thought they were not in the car where I thought they were. I think I got the grammar right on that. Anyway, I was trying to search for them. I was trying to find them, and I couldn't. But Jesus is saying that people will find the narrow way, or they have to find the narrow way. They have to be searching for it. It's not something that you just hop on. You have to be searching for it. And that's why there are few that will find that narrow way. As we continue on, verses 15 through 20. Beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing. And there's some place where we have to judge. We have to judge who is a false prophet so we can beware of them. But inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Then that's how we judge them. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. But, and you might even look at that kind of on the broad way, the way that people enter. You see false teachers or false prophets all over the place. They really are a dime a dozen. I know that's a cliche, but they're cheap. Like Solomon said, there's no end to the making of books, and especially now when anyone can self-publish a book. Anyone with a web camera can post a video on YouTube. People enter the Broadway, and there are many, many false prophets. False prophets abound. They line the Broadway, trying to peddle, trying to hawk their false teaching, their false prophecies. But look at the other side. The true followers are few and far between. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. So there's again that active part. Those who do, it's not just saying, Lord, Lord, it's doing the will of God. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Now that's an interesting contrast, isn't it? Or I don't know if contrast is the right word. But it is. I guess it is a contrast of how people think, and how God thinks. I've done great things. I have prophesied in your name. I have cast out demons. I have performed miracles. What have I not done for you, Lord? Well, you didn't do the will of my Father in heaven, he'll say, and therefore you practiced lawlessness. Lawlessness was your practice. And so, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter in the kingdom of heaven. I think that is an interesting verse for us to consider as Christians. Are we on the straight and narrow? Have we found the straight and narrow? Are we true followers? We need to continue to push towards that, to be that. Not be following after false prophets, but following after Jesus, following after the will of God. And yeah, we may be few and far between, but we need to be looking for what God would have us to do. We need to be following his will. Just Jesus said to the woman at the well, John chapter 4, the Lord is spirit, and he's looking for those to worship him in spirit and in truth. So what are we to do? Well, how can we become true followers of Jesus? Well, just as God said to Peter on the Mount of Transfiguration, hear ye him. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 29, Jesus says, listen to me. Listen to what I have to say. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock, and the rain fell, and the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And the foolish man's house went splat, and it fell. Great was its fall. We'll look at that last verse here momentarily. Hear Jesus. And really, it's not just hear Jesus. Don't be a forgetful hearer, but be a doer, James says in James chapter 1. So it's not just hear, it's do what Jesus says as well. All right. So Jesus says, hear me. Hear what I have to say. And those who listened to him did hear him. And what did they say? They said, wow. Just wow. Let's read. When Jesus had finished these words, he finished his Sermon on the Mount. The crowds were amazed at his teaching. They were amazed at his teaching. Why were they amazed? Because he taught with authority, or he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. So when we look at that, Jesus had and really has authority. And it's interesting that he says this here. Matthew writes this here. He observes this here. But then at the end of Matthew, at the end of his account of the gospel, he quotes Jesus as saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them into the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. So Jesus had authority. He spoke with authority, and he continues to have that authority because he is the Son of God. Now, I'll go ahead and point out, just as I have in the past, that he says, Matthew writes that he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. The idea of the scribe was, it's a respectable idea. I don't have any authority of my own. My authority, now the problem is they gather their authority from someone else, from another person, but really it becomes this genealogy, which Paul talks about being careful of, where they say, I was taught this by my teacher, who was taught this by his teacher, who was taught this by his teacher, and they just go back until they come to some prominent name. I remember when I was in college, there were some professors who prided themselves on their academic lineage, academic heritage. They were students of great teachers, and that's nice and all, but does that where their authority? Is that where their ability comes from? And the same could be said for these scribes. Did their authority come from this great teacher, or did this great teacher that they referenced, did he actually look at what God had to say? So, and that therein lies the real issue, the real point that we need to understand and that we need to keep in our minds is that Jesus is the authority. He spoke with authority. He had the authority. He has the authority. And so we have to continue to follow him. And it's interesting that if we want to be his disciple, what is it that we have to do? To make a disciple, the apostles were to baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that he had commanded. And so, that just goes more to talk about his authority. Jesus spoke not by saying, I was taught this by someone else or by someone else or by someone else. He said, just go back to Matthew the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, or I guess Matthew chapter 6, go in the last chapter. You have heard it said, but I say. So, there's his authority. No scribe, no mere scribe would have said anything like that. So Jesus taught as one having authority and not as their scribes. And the people were amazed at this. So And I think we need to start here, really focusing in on this is a basic idea of the kingdom of God, that this is Jesus. Jesus is the authority. He is the King. He is the Messiah. He is the Christ. He is the Anointed One. He is the Son of David. He is the rightful heir to the throne, and so forth and so on. Matthew's really wanting to point this out. And we're going to see more in the next chapter as we go into chapter 8, where this is recognized by people. So let's go into chapter 8 and let's show, first of all, I want to notice how Jesus healed, I should have put that in quotes, the worst of the worst. So if you want to put air quotes around that, the worst of the worst, because it's how they would have viewed. It's how his audience, or I guess those who were around him at the time, who were watching him, who were listening to him, it's how they would have seen Jesus, or seen who he was healing, or who he was dealing with. Well, like the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees say about him, he's a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of sinners. Well, let's look at, first of all, the first example that we have, where Jesus heals a leper. The most unclean that a person could be, especially then. Let's read verses 1 through 4 of Matthew chapter 8. When Jesus came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him, and a leper came to him and bowed down before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, "See that you tell no one, but go show yourself to the priest and present the offering that Moses commanded as a testimony to them." So Jesus heals this leper. This leper comes to him, this unclean human comes to him and says, "If you are willing, heal me, cleanse me of this leprosy." And Jesus says, yes. Jesus says, "I am willing, be cleansed." I think it's interesting that then Jesus says, don't go spreading this around. This is the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and people don't listen when Jesus says this, but Jesus doesn't want all of the attention yet. I was about to say undue attention. It's not undue attention, but it's attention that is before the time. It's not his time yet. He's got a whole lot to do on earth. He's got to be this great example for us. So it's not his time yet. He knows that once it gets out that he is who he is, and we've already seen that, it is getting out. The news about him spread so much farther than the news about John the Baptizer. John was localized in the southern Jordan River Valley, and the news about Jesus just went everywhere. It even crossed the border into Syria, I think it said. But he still wants to lay low. He wants to keep his head down for a little bit. He wants to do what he needs to do. And he tells him, "Go show yourself to the priest." He says, "Look, we're still under the old law at this point, so go do what you need to do. Go fulfill the law of Moses." But nevertheless, I think the point that we really want to focus on here is that Jesus healed a leper. He came in close contact with this leper, which was a no-no, and he cleansed him. No one would have, no hypocrite, no scribe or Pharisee would have done that. The second thing that we're going to look at is that he heals a Gentile. And I guess if there's anything worse than a leper, it's probably a Gentile. Now, there's one thing that is worse, and I'm going to say that tongue firmly planted in cheek. All right. But, just bear with me on this. Things are going to get a little humorous here shortly, but he heals a Gentile, or at least deals with a Gentile. Again, kind of cementing cementing the accusation that he's a friend to sinners. I mean, and you can't get much worse than a leper, but I mean, a Gentile is about the only thing worse than a Gentile is a tax collector. And I'm surprised he didn't heal a tax collector in this story either, or in this paragraph. But there is one more that is worst of the worst. I tell you what. We'll get to that in a second, though. Let's read verses 5 through 13. And when Jesus entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, imploring him, saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed at home, fearfully tormented. Jesus said to him, I will come and heal him. But the centurion said, Lord, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it. Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled, and said to those who were following. Now this is the real lesson here, but we'll get to it momentarily. Truly I say to you, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into the outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And Jesus said to the centurion, Go, it shall be done for you as you have believed. And the servant was healed that very moment. So Jesus here deals with a Gentile. And more importantly, I mean, he sees the faith, he sees the belief that this Gentile has in him. Again, more on that in a moment. But before we do that, we've got to get into this absolute worst person that Jesus would heal. Let's read verses 14 and 15 of Matthew chapter 8. And we even just have to say, and again, tongue firmly planted in cheek, we have to say that we have no idea why would Jesus sink to this level? I'd be humorous, yes. When Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and waited on him. Now, so Jesus healed the worst of the worst, a mother-in-law. And again, there's the little, whatever we call those emojis there, the sort of the pre emojis. He healed the mother-in-law of Peter. Now, I just want to say this, just in case my mother-in-law decides to watch this. There is no one better than my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law is the best mother-in-law. Now, my wife may disagree with me that her mother-in-law is better, but I still have to say my mother-in-law is the best mother-in-law ever. That's why I'm trying to be humorous with this. But Jesus did heal Peter's mother-in-law. And you could even say, just to put a more positive spin on it, well, I don't think spin's the right word, but Jesus cared about Peter. I mean, Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends. And he cared for Peter and for Peter's family. And that's why he healed the mother-in-law. But it's also interesting to point out that the mother-in-law got up. And I mean, so the healing was immediate, and it was so drastic that she could then go and do what a mother-in-law would do. That's feed those who are in her home. And she could do that, and that's part of the miraculous there. But Jesus healed the worst of the worst. He healed those who needed it most, those who probably couldn't get the respect of those who are around them, to the point that they could be healed by those who could. But I want to get back to the real lesson in this paragraph, and that's what Jesus says in. I didn't put it down here, but in the account of the Gentile, the account of the centurion, the real lesson is Jesus says, "I have not found such great faith." He didn't find faith like this in all of Israel. The ones who had the oracles of God, the ones who had that great blessing, who should have known who Jesus was. He had not found such great faith as this centurion, this Gentile centurion, who believed so deeply in Jesus, who knew who he was. And it's not just a hope, but it's actually knowing who Jesus is, knowing his power, knowing his authority. That he could speak his servant healed from, I don't know how far he was away. I mean, but from a distance, without even seeing him, much less being there to touch him, like he was for Peter's mother-in-law. But that's real faith. Knowing what Jesus can do, and knowing that he will, that he is willing to heal. And you can even see perhaps the faith in the leper, and then what that faith leads to do in the example of Peter's mother-in-law, serve. So, and this is in contrast, and keep in mind, Jesus is contrasting these, again, at least for the sake of humor, the worst of the worst, especially in that last case. He finds greater faith outside than he does within his own people. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. So he's not found such great faith. But then we have to turn it further. We have to go further and find not just the basics of who Jesus is, but what does this mean for us? Will you have that kind of faith, that kind of trust in Jesus, the trust that centurion had? And we can go to Matthew chapter 8, verses 18 through 27, and I think let's start in 18 through 20. And let's look at this this disciple who says, "I will follow you." But Jesus asks, "Have you counted the cost?" Does he really have the faith that is needed? No, he makes the claim, "I will follow you." When Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to depart to the other side of the sea. Then a scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus said to him, "The foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." The scribe says, "I will follow you." That seems like a faithful claim. It seems like a claim of faith, a claim of belief, that wherever Jesus goes, that's where this scribe is going. Has he counted the cost? Even the animals have their homes, but where's the home of Jesus? He doesn't get home until he ascends to heaven. Is this scribe counting the cost of following Jesus? The next thing we read of someone who, and again, keep in mind, this is a scribe. The first example is a scribe. So one of the Jews, and again, it's a contrast between the Gentile, the leper, the mother-in-law, versus this scribe. And then another of the disciples, probably again, one of his own people, one of the Jews, Another of the disciples, verses 21 and 22, says, Lord, permit me to first go and bury my father. But Jesus said, follow me and allow the dead to bury their own dead. So the disciple says, permit me first to go. And I want to focus on that, or I want to stress that word first, because Jesus had just given the Sermon on the Mount where he said, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. And he says that in a different way, just saying here, follow me. You know, the disciple was, he was trying to fulfill family obligations, I suppose you might say, or perhaps there's another way to look at this here. Maybe the father's not dead yet. Maybe he's still alive, and this disciple says, look, I want to be with my father. I want to follow my father. I want to follow in my father's footsteps, my earthly father's footsteps. And Jesus says, no, follow me. Follow me. Don't follow man. That can get you into trouble, but follow me. We need to follow Jesus. Does this guy have faith? Does he have faith in Jesus? No, he has faith in his father. He has faith in his lineage. Does the previous scribe, have faith in Jesus? No. He will lose his faith. He will lose that trust because he's looking for a place to live. He's looking for comfort. Comfort's not something he's going to find. If we go now to Matthew chapter 8, verses 23, we see even the 12, even the closest of the disciples, they don't have the same faith as that Gentile centurion. Go to verses 23 through 26. When he got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being covered with the waves. But Jesus himself was asleep. And they came to him and woke him, saying, Save us, Lord, we are perishing. He said to them, Why are you afraid, you men of little faith? And we'll stop there for just a moment. They say, We are perishing. We see the scribe say, I will follow you. We see the disciple saying, Permit me first to go. And we see the 12, those who are in the boat with him, saying, We are perishing. But Jesus responds, Have you counted the cost? Seek first the kingdom. Why are you afraid? Why are you afraid? And then he shows his power. He shows who he is. He rebukes the weather. Verses 26 and 27, if we'll pick up where we left off. He said to them, Why are you afraid, you men of little faith? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and it became perfectly calm. And the men were amazed and said, What kind of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? This is another one of those basics of the kingdom. What kind of man is this? Jesus rebukes this weather, and you have to ask. You have to ask, who has that power? Who has the power not only to rebuke the weather, but actually have that rebuke mean something to the weather? To actually be able to control the weather like that. See, I'm a firm believer in, the power of prayer to, ask God and that God will grant weather to change. I mean, just a little bit. I mean, it's not like, it's 25 degrees below zero and you got snow coming and all of a sudden you pray for 90-degree tropical weather, and it's not going to happen. I mean, if the weather forecast says it's going to be cold and snowy, eh, you know, God's not working miracles. I mean, and by miracle, I mean an honest to goodness miracle. I don't mean how people normally use miracles, the word miracle. I mean honest to goodness miracles. That's something that God does not do. Um, at least in my view, using my definition of miracle. He's not doing that now. He did that. He did that. I'm a firm believer in the miracles of the Bible. I'm not saying God can't do miracles and he didn't do miracles. He did. He did do those miracles and he certainly can. But what does God do now? Miracles were to prove the point of the Bible, prove that the message that the apostles preached was the message of God. Now that we have that message confirmed, we really don't need those miracles. But God still operates today, and providentially, He will provide for us. So go to James, and he talks about Elijah asking for rain and asking for drought and then rain, and it happened. And can we do that? Well, yeah, maybe not to the same extent as Elijah did, but I've seen it happen. I mean, whether that's just, sheer luck or God actually providing that the answer to that request, I don't know. I'd like to think that it's God providing for us. But let's get back to the point here. He was in the boat. The waves were coming over the side of the boat. They were sinking. I mean, enough that fishermen said, "We are perishing." Professional boaters were saying, "We are perishing." Why are they afraid? The one who can control, and granted, he hadn't shown this yet, but if they had known who he was, if they had really believed who he was, they would have said, Jesus is sleeping. I guess we could take a nap too. And everything would have been fine. But what kind of man is this? And that is kind of a basic thing. That's a basic idea of the kingdom. What kind of man is this? Well, he is God in the form of man. He is God become man. He is God with us. He is God in the flesh. But then we come to and we see in that passage the disciples maybe coming to a greater realization of who Jesus is. But then we see in the next paragraph that not everyone will accept him. No matter what Jesus does, not everyone is going to accept him. That's a lesson. That's a hard lesson for us as faithful Christians to understand. Why would you not accept Jesus? Well, let's look. Matthew chapter 8, verses 28 through 34. When he came to the other side, into the country of the Gadarenes, two men who were demon-possessed met him as they were coming out of the tombs. They were so extremely violent that no one could pass by that way. And they cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now there was a herd of many swine feeding at a distance from them. The demons began to entreat him, saying, "If you're going to cast us out, send us into that herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." And they came out and went into the swine, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea and perished in the waters. The herdsmen ran away and went to the city and reported everything, including what had happened to the demoniacs. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they implored him to leave their region. Not everyone will accept Jesus. The demons. I mean, we can look at the demons in this paragraph and see how they didn't want to be in his presence. Well, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Why would demons want to be in the presence of God? They want to be as far away from God as possible. Well, because of the judgment that's coming upon them. They didn't want to be in his presence. Interestingly, they said, "Have you come to torment us before the time?" Before what time? Before the appointed time. Is it judgment that they're looking forward to? Well, not looking forward. I mean, not looking forward in the way that we normally say it, but that they're referencing here. Is that the time? Is it the time when their power would really, is going to be pushed out of this world? Either way, they knew their time was drawing to an end. Have you come to torment us before the time? They didn't want to be in his presence because they knew that it was torment. It was torment for them it was torment time for them to be in his presence. Well, they couldn't make him leave. They couldn't make Jesus leave. So they asked him to make them leave. I find that interesting. I find that to be an interesting point that, these demons have no power over Jesus. They're not going to scare Jesus. They're not going to stop Jesus. And they know that. They know who Jesus is. Contrast that with the Gadarenes. More on that in a little bit. They don't really know who Jesus is. They don't believe who he is. These demons know who Jesus is, and that's probably part of the supernatural thing. But they can't make him leave. They know they can't make him leave, and they know that he's going to be victorious over them. So what do? They say, "Let us leave, send us away." So they ask him to make them leave. But also look at the Gadarenes. The Gadarene people didn't want to be in his presence, or I guess to put it in another way, they didn't want Jesus in their presence. I wonder if that's an interesting way to look at it. They didn't want Jesus in their presence. So what did they do? Well, first of all, why didn't they want Jesus to be in their presence? They lost their swine. They lost their pigs. They lost some wealth. They lost their livelihood. It's a steep cost. It's a steep cost. But what is it that Jesus says? That if these Gadarenes knew who Jesus was, they wouldn't have sent him away, because Jesus says that, anyone who loses, and I don't have that passage referenced anywhere, but, and then he lists all these possible family relations, wealth, livelihood. You're going to gain so much more in the kingdom by following Jesus. Now, these Gadarenes didn't believe that, didn't know that. They had no knowledge of that. They just know, well, we just lost our wealth. We just lost our wealth. But there's an interesting point that Matthew brings up. What did the herdsmen say? What did the herdsmen say when they ran away to talk to the town folk? When they reported everything, including what happened to the demoniacs. I find that interesting, that they were concerned about the demoniacs. And, you might say, well, it's pretty amazing that nobody could control these demoniacs. I think if you go to one of the other accounts of the gospel, Matthew says here, they were so extremely violent that no one could pass by that way. Go to a parallel passage, and I think in a parallel passage, Jesus only talks, or it's only talking about one of these demoniacs, I guess I should say, but couldn't be controlled. He couldn't be bound. The iron fetters, the iron cuffs that they used to chain him down, he just broke. He broke. He could not be controlled. So, you could see how it could be pretty amazing that excuse me. It'd be pretty amazing that Jesus would control these guys, that he would be able to bring them out of this rage. But what did these guys do? No one could pass by that way. They acted kind of like security guards in a sense. I mean, they kept strangers away. These people didn't want strangers here. And that's kind of an interesting point because I didn't get a chance to look back into it, but the Gadarenes or Gerasenes um, have something to do with people being foreigners. They weren't from around there, hence the pigs. Because, pigs aren't something that the Israelites or anybody in that area really would have. But, they probably didn't want people around them. They wanted to live in their own little enclave, and that was it. So did they lose their security? Did they lose their security force? Did they lose the lock on their gate, you might say? They really did not want Jesus around. They didn't really want anybody around, I guess, if that's the case. But still, they couldn't make Jesus leave. But he did anyway. Now, this is kind of an interesting point. The demons couldn't make Jesus leave. So what did they do? They asked Jesus, because they knew who Jesus was. They asked Jesus to make them leave. We can't make you leave, but send us away. But the Gadarenes didn't know who Jesus was. They didn't know that they couldn't make him leave. But this is an interesting point. Jesus doesn't force himself. He doesn't force people to follow him. If people don't want to follow him, that's just the way it is. People have to make a choice to follow him. And that's a lesson that I think we all need to learn. We need to understand. People need to make a choice. I know there are some who would teach that there is no choice except for God's choice. God chose you one way or the other. You're either saved or you're not. But God says choose. You've got to make a choice. So we hope that you would be encouraged to choose to believe in who Jesus is and follow him. Not just say, I'll follow you some convenient time, but follow him today. So look to what Jesus says as to what you must do to follow him. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and call it a night for tonight. Thank you for joining us, and let's go ahead and talk about what we always talk about at this time. The address on your screen is if you're in Palmyra, Indiana, and want to visit on Sunday morning, we have Bible study at 9:15. We have a worship service, which is simulcast here on YouTube at 10 a.m., and we have an evening worship service at 5 p.m. That address. If you have any questions, give us a call, leave a message on our voicemail, or email me at preacher@palmyrachurchofchrist.org. preacher@palmyrachurchofchrist.org. You can also go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/palmyra.churchofchrist, or you can leave a comment here in the comment stream below in the video. And I hope that the study so far has been a blessing to you, and I hope you'll join us next Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. as we continue on studying, starting in Matthew chapter 9. So let's go ahead and have a prayer, and we'll be virtually dismissed. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day that you've given us. We're so thankful for the brief rain that we've had. May it nourish our gardens and nourish the farms. Give life-giving water to the farms, so that we may have the blessings of that food which gives us life. We ask, Father, that you'll be with those who need you at this time, and in whatever their sickness or whatever their trouble is, help them to see the benefit that you can give them, the peace that you can give them. And help us, Father, to be those who would show your mercy and your peace at this time for them and really for everyone, Father. Help us to be closer followers to you. And this we pray in your Son's name.